A Viking harbor never truly slept. Even before sunrise, movement already covered the shoreline. Fishermen dragged wet nets across muddy docks while cold summer rain drifted over crowded Scandinavian coastlines. Merchants shouted beside stacked barrels filled with dried fish, furs, iron tools, timber, honey, and silver carried from lands hundreds of miles away. Shipbuilders hammered fresh planks into longship frames darkened by salt water and smoke. Everything moved constantly, and that movement became one of the greatest sources of Viking power. Most people imagine Viking settlements as isolated wooden villages, trapped between forests and freezing seas. The reality looked completely different. Many Viking harbors functioned more like living transportation machines, connecting enormous parts of medieval Europe together through rivers, coastlines, and trade routes that never truly stopped flowing. The question is not whether the Vikings traded. They did. The real mystery is how relatively small Scandinavian settlements became some of the busiest movement hubs in the medieval world. Because the Viking economy depended on speed, a ship delayed too long misses favorable winds. A merchant arriving late loses trade opportunities. A harbor cut off from communication loses information faster than it loses silver. And information mattered almost as much as cargo itself. Picture green northern coastlines alive with activity during warm summer mornings. Long ships arriving from distant rivers, foreign merchants stepping onto crowded docks speaking unfamiliar languages, children carrying supplies through noisy marketplaces where travelers discuss storms, political conflict, trade shortages, and wealthy coastal towns far across the sea. The Viking harbor absorbed everything: goods, people, news, opportunity. And perhaps that constant movement explains why Viking society expanded across so much of Europe so quickly. Because while many medieval kingdoms still depended heavily on slow land routes, the Norse built entire civilizations around mobility connected directly to water. The docks themselves became controlled chaos. That chaos mattered. A successful Viking harbor could not remain quiet for long because ships carried more than trade goods. They carried timing. Picture muddy harbor roads packed with workers unloading cargo beneath cloudy summer skies while ropes creak against wet timber and seabirds circle above crowded shorelines filled with smoke, noise, and movement. Every arriving ship changes the harbor instantly. Fresh fish must be preserved quickly before spoilage begins. Foreign traders search for silver, walrus ivory, iron, amber, or furs before competitors secure the best deals first. Ship crews repair sails soaked with rainwater and salt after dangerous crossings through rough northern seas. Everything operates against time. That pressure forced Viking harbors to become remarkably efficient for the medieval world. The Norse understood something many kingdoms struggled to understand fully. Slow systems lose opportunities. Fast systems absorb them. And Viking harbors absorbed constantly. Food moved inland. Silver moved outward. Information spread in every direction. A sailor arriving from England might warn merchants about conflict disrupting trade routes near the coast. Another crew returning from Eastern Europe carries news about river conditions, political instability, or profitable markets opening farther inland. The harbor becomes an intelligence network, not officially, naturally. And because Viking society remained highly mobile, information traveled surprisingly quickly compared to many medieval kingdoms, where communication still depended heavily on dangerous roads and fragmented local authority. The result was adaptability. If one region weakened economically, ships shifted elsewhere. If storms blocked certain routes, merchants rerouted cargo through alternative waterways. The Viking world rarely stayed still long enough to become predictable, and unpredictability creates power. Because the side moving faster usually understands changing conditions before slower societies even recognize danger approaching. The Viking harbor also connected worlds that rarely understood one another completely. That made these places feel enormous compared to surrounding settlements. Picture crowded summer marketplaces beside rivers where Scandinavian traders negotiate with merchants arriving from Anglo-Saxon England, Frankish territories, Slavic regions, and distant Eastern trade networks stretching toward Byzantium and beyond. Different languages, different clothing, different currencies, different gods, all moving through the same muddy docks surrounded by green hills, wet timber warehouses, fish smoke drifting through cold northern air, and long ships arriving constantly from distant coastlines. The Viking harbor became medieval globalization in miniature, and globalization changes societies quickly. Foreign goods transformed local economies. Foreign knowledge changed navigation routes. Foreign silver flooded Scandinavian trade systems so aggressively that entire hordes buried across the Viking world still appear centuries later beneath farms and forests. But wealth also increased danger. Busy harbors attracted thieves, spies, rival traders, and political enemies searching constantly for advantage. That forced Viking ports to develop systems protecting movement itself. Reputation mattered. Agreements mattered. Communication mattered. A harbor known for cheating merchants loses trade. A region known for unsafe docking loses ships. A ruler unable to protect commerce loses silver faster than armies can replace it. Again and again, Viking power depended less on conquest alone and more on keeping movement alive. Because once ships stop arriving, entire economic systems begin weakening immediately. Food shortages spread, information slows, trade collapses. The harbor was never just a place where boats stopped temporarily. It was circulation, the beating heart of the Viking world itself. And perhaps that explains why so many Norse settlements formed near rivers, fjords, and coastal inlets rather than deep inland. The Vikings did not build civilization away from movement. They built civilization directly on top of it. Ship repair may have been one of the most important activities in any Viking harbor. Without maintenance, the entire system collapses. Salt water destroys wood slowly. Storms tear sails apart. Wet ropes weaken after repeated voyages across rough northern seas. A damaged ship threatens trade, communication, fishing, and survival simultaneously. That is why Viking harbors often sounded less like peaceful villages and more like industrial construction zones. Picture crowded shipyards beside rainy Scandinavian rivers, where workers drag heavy timber through wet mud while blacksmiths hammer glowing iron rivets into curved wooden hulls, surrounded by smoke, shouting crews, and the smell of pine tar spreading through humid summer air. Nothing remains still. Crews repair ships while merchants negotiate nearby. Children carry tools between workshops. Travelers arrive soaked from river journeys while fishermen clean fresh catches beside crowded docks, alive with constant labor. The Viking harbor functioned because thousands of separate actions happened simultaneously without stopping movement completely. That required coordination, and coordination creates strength. The Norse rarely built giant, centralized bureaucracies controlling every detail of trade and transportation. Instead, Viking harbors operated through overlapping systems driven by necessity. Shipbuilders needed merchants, merchants needed fishermen, fishermen needed repaired ships, travelers needed safe docking. Every layer supported every other layer. And because water transportation remained dramatically faster than most medieval roads, the harbor became one of the most economically valuable places in the entire Viking world. A powerful harbor attracts wealth automatically, but it also attracts information, opportunity, and influence. The Vikings understood this deeply. Whoever controls movement controls growth. That lesson shaped Scandinavian expansion for centuries across Europe and beyond. The Viking harbor never stopped moving because the Viking world itself could never afford to stop moving. Trade depended on motion, fishing depended on motion. Communication depended on motion. Exploration depended on motion. Everything connected back to mobility. Beautiful Scandinavian coastlines filled with crowded docks, noisy marketplaces, muddy roads, rivers packed with ships, smoke rising from workshops, green forests, wet shipyards, and long ships arriving beneath gray summer skies were not isolated frontier settlements surviving quietly at the edge of Europe. They were active engines driving one of the most connected movement systems in the medieval world. And perhaps that is the strangest part of all. Many medieval kingdoms appeared larger, wealthier, and more politically powerful than the Viking world. But size alone does not create influence. Movement creates influence. Fast trade expands wealth. Fast communication spreads information. Fast transportation exploits opportunity before rivals react. The Norse understood this instinctively. That is why Viking ships traveled constantly, why harbors remained crowded constantly, why Scandinavian trade networks expanded across rivers, coastlines, and foreign ports with remarkable speed for the medieval era. The Viking world survived because it stayed connected, and connected systems adapt faster than isolated ones. Again and again, Viking success emerged from movement rather than stability. The harbor reflects that perfectly, a place where ships arrived before storms spread, where rumors traveled faster than kings, where silver changed hands beside wet docks before distant rulers even understood how quickly the Norse economy was growing around them. The Vikings did not build quiet civilizations. They built civilizations that moved, and for centuries, movement itself became one of the greatest weapons the Viking world ever possessed.